Hi, I'm Dave Hilowitz. This video is about legato. Specifically, how to script for true legato in Decent Sampler. If you watched last week's video about how to do this in SFC, the next part of this video is going to seem strangely familiar to you. In fact, you may want to actually just skip to the sample creation portion of this video. Time code is below. So let's start at the top. What is legato? Legato is, of course, the transitions between notes. If you think of an instrument like the violin or the trombone, instruments that generally only play one note at a time, when you transition from one note to another, it's a very specific sound, and a very specific sound that is not necessarily captured by conventional sampling. In a conventional sample library, you capture every note or almost every note. And when you set your sample library up, you do some mapping so that when somebody plays like a C3, it plays the wave file that corresponds to that note, C3. Then if somebody stops playing the C3 and they start playing a D, the sample engine stops playing that C3 file and it starts playing the D file instead. And that setup where you're stopping one note and then starting another note is great for modeling a ton of different real-world instruments like pianos and drums, instruments where there's no real noticeable transition between notes. But for other instruments, that can be very unnatural. Bowed stringed instruments, for example, have very pronounced slides between notes sometimes. You actually need to play another sample in between those two samples. And that other sample that you need to play is a recording of the transition between those two notes. So that's what true legato is. So if you think about it, this can get massively complicated very, very fast. Let's say you had an instrument that could play 36 different notes. If you wanted to include transitions from every note to every other note, you would need 36 times 35 notes. So instead of recording 36 samples, you're now recording 1,260 samples. Horrible. And it's not just the scripting that's complicated, it's actually just chopping up that many samples. And then imagine that you have different velocity layers or round robins. The combinatorics could just get totally brutal. And it's why a lot of people who are sampling these instruments, they just don't bother with legato because it increases the amount of work just exponentially. Of course, most people don't actually sample all the possible transitions from every note to every note. Sometimes you'll see just one octave's worth of transitions, so C to C sharp, C to D, C to E, but it'll only go up to one octave, and then they'll do that for every note. Still, it multiplies all of the samples you have by 12. So if you have 36 samples, well, now you need 432. So still a ton of work. Okay, having said all that, let's get started on our instrument. So I'm not going to record a full instrument right now because I don't have time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to record like 5 transitions on the viola, and then we can set it up in the sampler and just see how the scripting works. So I'm going to go through all of the sample chopping pretty quickly. I've done a bunch of other videos about how to chop up samples. If you do want to see a slower walkthrough of how I edit samples, check out my How I Make Sample Libraries video, linked below. As you can see, I do my actual sampling work in Reaper. I use Reaper because it's got fantastic scripting and it's very flexible, but you can use pretty much any audio editing software. The first thing I'm going to do is get rid of anything I know is garbage. Then I'm going to chop up my samples and identify them. Right now, I'm chopping by hand because I only have a small number of samples. If I had a larger number, I would make use of Reaper's fantastic dynamic split tool, which can do a lot of this work for you. Okay, so we've identified everything. We've got a sustain, then a transition, sustain, transition, etc., etc. This, of course, is a very small sample set, but it should be enough to show you how to do the mapping. Now I'm going to take all of these legato samples and I'm going to put them on their own track. So the sustains will be on one track and the legatos will be on another. Then I'm going to name each track according to which type of note I've put on the track. Doing this helps me name the wave files that I'm outputting. because I can actually include the track name as part of the wave file name. That way I can get wave files that include sustain or legato as part of their names. Next, I'm going to figure out what notes we're dealing with. This is another example of something that I would normally not be doing by hand. In my How I Make Sample Libraries video, I show off some very cool scripts that detect and fix wave file pitches automatically. Still, for 8 samples, I think we can do it by hand the old-fashioned way. In order to do this, I'm going to put a tuner plugin on the track. I love mTuner by Melda. It's free, and it actually gives the MIDI note name of the note, so that's very helpful. And now I'm just going to go through all of my sustain notes, and I'm going to fix their pitches as needed. And I'm going to make each one loop using the same technique that I used in my How I Make Sample Libraries video. As I move along, I'm also going to create regions and label them according to pitch. This will make it easy to export in an organized fashion. Next, I'm going to go through all of my transitions. The only real requirement about this is that the transitions should fall in exactly the same spot in each of my exported files. Doing this hugely speeds up the work when you're putting together your libraries. I'm just going to use these grid lines from Reaper. My transition will happen exactly 2 grid lines after the start of the file. And I can figure out exactly how many samples that corresponds to later on. Legato transitions for violin and viola are super easy to identify if you look at the waveform. It will either get quieter or louder right at the point, but either way, you'll see some change in the waveform happening right where the notes switch. If you haven't done this before, you'll learn to recognize them visually pretty quickly, I think. In order to get these to line up, all I do is grab the wave file right where the transition is, hold down the Option key, and drag until the transition point is lined up with the grid line. Once I'm done with this, I'm also going to create regions for these, of course, and label them. You'll notice that each of these region names has 2 notes in it. There's the note we're transitioning from, and there's a note we're transitioning to. Next, I'm going to configure the region render matrix. This is this cool grid-based thing that tells Reaper which regions I want to export and which track it should grab the audio from. I want to export the legato regions from the legato track and the sustain regions from the sustain track. Remember how I made a big deal about separating out the legato samples onto their own track? This is where we're rewarded for having done that. In the render dialog, I'm going to configure my file names so that they include both the region name and the track name. We can actually click on the Files button, and it will show us what the names of the files it's about to export are going to be. This is a good way of double-checking to make sure you have the right settings. The only other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we're also outputting loop markers. I've labeled all my loop regions so that they start with a hash sign, and we can tell Reaper to only export regions that start with a hash sign. I think we're finally ready to export. Okay, let's make a sample library out of these. So first things first, I'm going to launch Ableton Live because that's what's most convenient for me to work in. I'm going to pull up Decent Sampler, and I'm going to launch my text editor, in this case, Sublime Text. I'm going to create a new blank text file called violalegato.ds preset. I'm also going to open my browser and point it to the Decent Sampler manual. Now, the Decent Sampler manual actually contains a version of this tutorial as part of it. That's Appendix F. I'm going to pretend that isn't there so that we can just work through this from scratch together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the boilerplate from the end of the manual. That should get the ball rolling for our preset. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a group for the sustain samples. Just going to keep one of these here so that I can use it as a template. I'm going to grab the file names from the Finder. Just going to hit Command-C and paste them in here. Then I'm just going to do some fancy footwork in Sublime Text so that I can edit multiple lines at once. Basically, we just want them to kind of look like this line up here. That's our template. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to set the root note for each sample. I'm just going to grab this part of the file name and paste it here. I'm using MIDI note names for this tutorial. In general, it's a better idea to use MIDI note numbers because those are standardized across all pieces of software, whereas A3 can mean a different thing depending on which sampler you're using. Now I'm going to set the low note and high note attributes. And I'm going to use the same values there. Next, I'm going to do some reordering. Specifically, I want to make sure that A3 comes after G3. I'm going to get rid of this. And right now, I'm just going to do some gap filling so that we go all the way from C3 all the way up to A3, let's say. Now I'm going to drag this into Decent Sampler, and we can make sure that we've got everything working so far. Okay, right now we don't have any kind of voice muting in place, so we can play chords. And there's no attempt at legato. So the first thing we want to do towards getting this to be legato is we want to make this instrument monophonic. When I say monophonic, I don't mean like one channel of audio, I mean just playing one note at a time. The way that we do this is we assign all of our samples to a tag. And we do that using the tags attribute. Tags are just little bits of text that we can associate with samples. Any sample or group of samples can be associated with any number of tags. The tags attribute takes a comma-separated list of tags. We're just going to pick an arbitrary name for the time being. In this case, I think sustain. On its own, this doesn't actually do anything. We're really just labeling the samples in this group. Next, I'm going to use the silenced by tags attribute. Silenced by tags also takes a comma-separated list of tags. It tells the engine to stop playing the current sample if another sample with the specified tag gets triggered. In other words, you get to specify which other samples silence the first group of samples. In this case, we're going to use that same tag, sustain. This means that every time the engine triggers one of these sustain samples, it silences any other sustain sample that might already be playing. In other words, this group of samples is self-muting. Okay, let's hear how this sounds. Well, it's doing what we asked it to, but that sounds pretty terrible. It's cutting off the first sample and starting the second one almost immediately, and that sounds pretty bad. So now we're going to add another attribute called silencing mode. Silencing mode allows us to control how voices get stopped. There are two options. There's a default option, which is called fast. That's what we just heard. The second option is normal, and normal actually causes the release phase of the envelope to play out. In other words, it's as though you just stop the note by letting up on the key. What's great about that is we can then specify a release phase length by just using the release attribute. I'm going to make it 1 second so we can hear the difference clearly. Okay, let's play it in Decent Sampler. Okay, so that's cool, but we have yet to actually make use of any of our legato transitions. It's time to add a second group. And I'm going to add that in exactly the same way that I did the sustain samples earlier. I'm going to grab the file names. I'm going to do a little bit of fancy editing work in Sublime Text so that I can edit multiple lines at once. Since these are legato samples, they actually have two pitches in their file names. The pitch we're coming from and the pitch we're going to. We're going to use that second pitch, the to pitch, as the value for our root note. I'm going to set the low note and high note values to be the same. Of course, if we play this in Decent Sampler now, it's going to sound terrible because we haven't set up our legato voice muting at all. To fix this, we need to do several things. First, we're going to assign this new group to a tag. Let's call it legato. Next, we need to specify that the first group gets silenced by that second group. So we're actually going to change this silence by tags, and we're going to have it be silenced by legato. We're also going to make use of the trigger attribute. Here we have a bunch of options, two of which are very useful for our purposes. You can use a value of first, which means that the sample will only be played if no other notes are playing. Then you can use a value of legato, which means that the sample will only be played if some other notes are already playing. These two options fit our scenario perfectly. So I'm going to go up to the first group and I'm going to put trigger equals first. And I'm going to go down to the second group and do trigger equals legato. So now let's go back into Ableton and I'm going to play a D and then an E. So there's our legato transition. But there are a couple things wrong with it. The first problem is it comes quite late after I hit that other key. You'll remember that when we did our sample editing, we made sure that all of our legato transitions occurred at the same point in their respective files, exactly 2 grid marks after the start of the file. All we have to do to fix this issue is to figure out what that offset is and add it to all of our legato samples. Ordinarily, this process involves a bunch of trial and error, but for the purposes of this example, I happen to know that a value of 43,000 works really well. Since we're going to be starting this wave halfway through, there's a chance that we're going to get a click at the start of the file, so I'm also going to add an attack to the envelope. So I've just noticed another problem. If I play 3 notes in a row, the legato that's already playing doesn't silence itself. Luckily, that's another easy fix. All I have to do is set the second group to mute itself. We're going to go back in here, and I'm going to add a silenced by tags attribute. And yeah, we just want it to be silenced by itself, the legato group. It's probably a good idea for us to copy this silencing mode and release as well. I'm just going to move the release so that it's after the attack, just for aesthetic reasons. I'm also going to add amp vel track equals 0, which will mean that the engine will ignore the velocity and play all the samples at the same volume. It just makes it easier to test this kind of thing. I think I can actually change this release so that it's more like 0.3 rather than 1 full second. Ooh, that's sounding great, actually. But there's several problems still. First, those transitions are actually getting triggered more often than they should. If I play D then E, I get my DE transition, which is great. But if I play F then E, I also get that same transition, and it sounds really weird. In a real-world scenario, we would have a recording of most or all of the transitions, and we would definitely have a different file to play for that specific transition because it's only a half step. But either way, we don't want that DE transition to play any time we're transitioning into an E. In other words, we want to specify that the engine should only play our DE transition when we're actually coming from a D. Luckily, there's an attribute for that. Previous notes. Let's go back to our file. You'll remember that when we did our mapping for the legato, we used the 2 pitch, the second pitch in this file name, as our root note. We never told the engine anything about the pitch we were coming from. Previous notes is where we get to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab this token and I'm just going to paste it here. So now it is clear we only play this sample if we're coming from a G3 and going to an A3. Previous notes can actually take a comma-separated list of notes, which can actually be super helpful if you have a situation where you have one transition that needs to be used in a variety of different situations. For the time being, though, we're just going to specify one note. Let's go back into Ableton and listen to it. So I'm going to play DE. We should get that transition. Yep. Now I'm going to play FE, and what we want to listen for is we want to make sure that that transition doesn't play. Okay, you couldn't see it, but I played FE there. The transition definitely didn't play, but also, the F never stopped. Basically, what happened is the engine looked through this. Since we haven't matched any legato samples, the engine just keeps playing that first note from the first group. That's bad. We need a fallback that will play when we don't match any of our transitions. Specifically, we want these samples up here to play, but of course we don't want them to play if there actually is a transition. The way around this is to add lines for all of the possible transitions, from every note to every other note. We're going to do this the longhand way at first because it makes for a better tutorial, and then I'm going to show you a way that you can save some space in your mapping files. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all of these and I'm going to bring them down, and then we can just kind of work through them one by one. Make sure that these are actually ordered correctly. So this we're going to keep as is. There's no transition to D. and we just want to keep it there. Also going to add a line for D sharp 3 because there's no transition to that. Haven't really dealt with accidentals very much in this. Next, we've got our legato transition. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make a new line here. And the new line is going to match the same root note and low note and high note that we have in our legato transition, but it's going to have a different previous note. I'm just going to do the entire range that I care about. So I'm going to do one here for C sharp. We're going to skip D because we actually do have a transition from D to E. Do D sharp 3, E3, F3, F sharp 3. Okay, so that's our full range for the note E. And then we're just going to repeat this for all of the remaining notes. So you can see here we've got a full sequence across the entire range of notes that we care about. C to G, C sharp to G, D to G, D sharp to G, etc., etc. And we're using the sustained samples in any place where we don't have the legato sample to work with. But there's a nice shorthand way of writing exactly the same thing. Because previous notes actually can take multiple values, you can actually just put all of these as a comma-separated list, and then you only need 2 lines per note combination. This should definitely reduce the number of lines that you need for your fallback samples. We just got rid of all of those lines in favor of just this. Now we're going to do the same thing for all of the remaining ones. Okay, it's been a while since we actually listened to this. Let's go back into Ableton and give it a spin. Much, much better. Of course, those situations where we don't actually have a legato transition don't sound as good as the ones where we do. But it's good that we at least have our fallbacks in place. By the way, there's another cool thing that you can use, which is legato interval. Legato interval is essentially just a different way of specifying the same information. Essentially, it makes decisions about which note to play based on the distance between the last note and this note. For example, here, you could say legato interval 2, and that means we should only play this E3 when the distance between the previous note and this new note is 2 semitones. The benefit of using this approach is it means you could actually reuse your legato transitions, like if you want to pitch bend them up or down a semitone or 2, without having to make a whole bunch of new lines in your file. Okay, so the only remaining problem now is that when you do a legato transition and you hold the note, eventually the note dies down. That's because we only recorded a short legato transition that doesn't loop. What we want to do is we want to play our legato notes and then we want to transition back into these sustained samples because they actually loop. Here's a mock-up of what I'm trying to do in Reaper. So as you can see, it starts with a sustain, it goes into the legato, and then it comes back to the sustain. Doing mock-ups like this in your audio editing software can be really useful, especially if you're trying to figure out attack and release times. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new group. I'm going to assign it an arbitrary tag. Let's call it legato sustain. And it's going to be self-muting, just like the other legato group. Definitely don't want 2 of these playing at the same time. And I'm actually just going to grab the silencing mode and attack and release from the other group. Seems like it should work. Next, I'm going to grab all of the samples from up here and just paste them in. And this is pretty much what we want, except for one small thing. If I play these now, these legato sustain samples are going to trigger too soon. Because they have basically the same settings as this legato group, they're going to trigger exactly at the same time as our legato group. So you'll get legato transitions and sustains playing simultaneously. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put an envelope on the legato sample so that it dies down during its decay phase. So let's say decay equals 0.3, like 300 milliseconds. I also want to make sure that I add trigger legato to this. We may also want to just add a little offset so we don't start right at the beginning of the file. Okay, let's hear how that sounds. Okay, that sounds pretty great, actually. Obviously, in a real-world scenario, I would probably spend a few hours tweaking it until I got it to sound really smooth. But yeah, that's it. That's the general idea, how to configure legato. Okay, I think that's it. If you enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you could hit like, and if you haven't done so already, now is a great time to subscribe. I got a bunch more videos on the way, so yeah, stay tuned.